Introduction that you gave about myself and the whole webinar, and I hope we do full justice to this topic. By the way, I am Indu. Thanks again, Raj. I am Indu. I'm a project manager as well as a trainer. As you can see on the screen, I am a PMP as well as a PMI ACT. I chose this particular topic for today's webinar because it's a very important topic. In the fourth edition of the PMBOK, the stakeholder management section was included under the communication management knowledge area. But I think the people at PMI, they have realized that stakeholder engagement is of utmost importance because stakeholders are very crucial to making a project either a success or a failure. So now stakeholder engagement has a chapter of its own. This will be the last chapter in the PMBOK, and it is chapter 13. This is not the only change the PMI has made in the PMBOK. They have also moved the stakeholder management more from a management perspective into an engagement perspective, because they want the stakeholders to feel that they are also part of the project. It's not the project manager directing the others, telling them what to do. So those are some of the changes that you will see in the PMBOK. Now, moving on, I hope everyone can see the first slide. This is mainly an introduction into the process of stakeholder engagement. Now, this area of stakeholder engagement, it includes all the processes that are required, first of all, to identify who are the people, the groups, or the organizations that can impact or be impacted by the project that we are in. So when we say people, they could be the sponsor, the champion, or various other teams, even the client through which with whom we have a contract, etc. So those are some of the people groups that can be called as the stakeholders. And sometimes we could have organizations like regulatory bodies, governmental organizations, etc. that who are watching our project, or they may be impacted by the changes brought about in our project. We also need to develop appropriate management strategies to effectively engage the stakeholders, because when the project manager takes into account all these stakeholders, all of them may not require the same attention, or the same strategy may not work for all the stakeholders. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all, so we need to have the appropriate management strategies which will make these stakeholders a part of the project so that the project can go to completion. The last point is this area of stakeholder engagement is asking us to focus on continuous communication with the stakeholders. Now this phrase, continuous communication, says the importance of why the PMBOK had actually included stakeholder engagement under the communications knowledge area in the fourth edition. But now, of course, it has a new chapter of its own. It is now included as the 10th knowledge area. Any questions about the introduction to stakeholder engagement? Okay, I'm assuming no questions. In case you do have any, please feel free to interrupt and let me know your questions. I will answer it to the best I can. Now, moving on, how important is this chapter from a real-life perspective? Now, as you may have realized, most of the chapters in the PMBOK tend to be gray. They will speak about the ideal conditions of a project, what is the project manager ideally supposed to do. Sometimes it may be difficult to execute those idealistic situations mentioned in the PMBOK, but this area of stakeholder engagement is one area where you can practically use it in a project. So even if you're not going to get the PMP exam right away, you will still benefit by listening to this webinar, because you are going to get some real life practical tips which are going to help you engage your stakeholders in your real life projects. And we will also talk about how this knowledge area of stakeholder engagement is going to be important from a PMP exam point of view. This is one of the most important areas as far as the PMP exam is concerned. You will get a few questions, about 5 to 7 questions usually are there from this area. It is because the stakeholder is very crucial to the success of a project. So we need to know how to continuously engage them throughout the project life cycle. So that is why it has an importance of its own. And as we move along the webinar, I will also be telling you where are the areas that you need to concentrate on. So when you study for your PMP exam, you can pay more attention to those areas. Now the stakeholders engagement area, it is the 10th knowledge area in the PMBOK 5th edition. And as we know, there are totally 47 processes under all the knowledge areas. For the stakeholder engagement area, it has 4 processes of its own. The first process under the stakeholder engagement knowledge area will be the identify stakeholders process. Okay. Now this identify stakeholders is coming under the initiating process group. Now if you remember, if you go to the grid which is placed in the PMBOK 5th edition, there are only 2 process groups which fall under the initiating process group, and identify stakeholders is the second process group which is coming under the initiating process group. So that is the reason why this particular knowledge area is very important from a PMP exam perspective. It is because it is the second process that will take place in a project. So in the first process, as we know, in the initiating process group, we will get started with the project. Now, as soon as we get started with the project, the next step would be to identify who are all the stakeholders that are involved in our particular project. So when we say identify the stakeholders, usually people ask a question, like who are all the stakeholders? How do we go about identifying them? Now, the stakeholders could be the sponsor or our vendors. They could also be classified as stakeholders. But usually people tend to ask 2 questions. Now, if somebody is opposing our project, do we include that person as a stakeholder? Now, the answer is yes, because the official definition of stakeholders means these are the people who are positively or negatively impacted by the project we are leading. So, whether it's a positive stakeholder or a negative stakeholder, they will all be included in our identifying stakeholders process group. So here it's very crucial that we identify the stakeholders, and there is also another question that people bring about: do we include a competitor as a stakeholder? There are 2 different views which people take on this particular question. Some people tend to take the competitor as a negative stakeholder, and in some other places, people do say that it should be viewed as a risk. And the PMBOK does not mention more about this, but there are 2 opinions regarding inclusion of competitors as stakeholders. Now the second process group will be the plan stakeholder management. Now this is coming under the planning process group. Like when we go for the PMP exam, we are having a lot of ITTOs, so it may be difficult to remember all of the ITTOs. That is why we have it in this particular order. So that way, when you get trained through this method, you will be able to remember all these process groups and ITTOs during your exam. See, the very first step is we have just started the project and we don't even know who the people are. So that is why we have identified stakeholders under the initiating process group. We are trying to figure out who are all the people that we need to contact later on during the course of the project. Now next, after identifying all these stakeholders, we need to have some plan to manage all these people that we have identified in the initiating process group. So that is why plan stakeholder management comes under the planning process group. So here a lot of planning takes place. Essentially this plan stakeholder management, it is the process of finding the appropriate management strategies that will effectively engage the stakeholder throughout the project life cycle. Now, why do we say effectively engage the stakeholders throughout the project life cycle? The reason is because we need to have plans to deal with the positive stakeholders as well as the negative stakeholders. So that is the reason why we say we need to effectively engage the stakeholders so our project proceeds to completion. Now, how do we engage them? Now, this is all based on the analysis of the needs of the stakeholders. It could be their interests, like if they are going to see a positive result, then they will be very highly interested in seeing it to completion, etc. And we also need to assess what is the potential impact they have on our project success. So any questions so far from the two processes that we have seen? Okay, I'm assuming that there are no questions until now. So let's move on to the third process, which comes under stakeholder engagement. Now, the third process that we have is the actual process of managing the stakeholder engagement. Now, since we are actually managing the stakeholders, this particular part comes under the executing process group. Now, I'm saying it this way, and I've also color-coded it, so that way you will find it easier to remember during the PMP exam. Now, as we know, the PMP exam is a very long exam. It's for about 4 hours. So when we are into the heat of the moment, it's very possible that some of the simple things, well, may be difficult to recollect, and that is the reason why I have actually color-coded it. And there's also another way to remember it. It's because when you're managing the stakeholders, you're actually executing the project. So that is why it comes under the executing process group. So here, during this managed stakeholder engagement, some of the things that we do are communicating and working with the stakeholders. Now, why do we need to communicate with them or work with them? That is because we need to make sure that we are always meeting their needs or expectations. Sometimes a few stakeholders might have some issues, so we need to address those issues, and we also need to make the stakeholders aware that we are actually looking into the issues that they have raised, and we are trying to resolve those issues. That is why we are saying that communication is very important for the managed stakeholder engagement process group. And as we know, the project manager spends about 90% of their time communicating with others. So that is why this managed stakeholder engagement is a very important process area. Now moving to the last process area under this knowledge area, that will be the control stakeholder engagement. Now the name itself says control. So that means this has to come under the monitoring and controlling process group. So during the control stakeholder engagement, what we are doing is we are trying to monitor the overall project stakeholder relationships. Sometimes people may have joined the organization or they may have left, etc., or some changes would have taken place. That is why we need to continuously adjust our management strategies, and we also need to make some changes to our plans for engaging the stakeholders, because it is very possible that some changes have taken place during the life cycle of the project. So these are the 4 processes that come under the stakeholder engagement knowledge area. So these 4 processes are the identify stakeholders. So first of all, we get started with the project. We don't even know who are all the stakeholders. So we need to identify all the people. The next, after we have identified the respective stakeholders, we need to have a plan to manage them. So this plan stakeholder management comes under the planning process group. After we have a plan and after we have some strategies in place, after we thought about some strategies to deal with these different stakeholders, we need to actually manage those stakeholders. So manage stakeholder engagement comes under the executing process group, and throughout the course of the project, we need to control the stakeholder engagement too. Sometimes some people may tend to take over the project. So in those cases, we need to have a strategy to bring down their involvement and to make the appropriate changes. So these are all the different processes that are coming under the stakeholder engagement knowledge area. So do you have any questions regarding the processes? Since I'm not seeing any questions, I'm assuming it's all clear. So we are moving on to the first process. So here we are going to talk about the details of these 4 processes that are coming under this knowledge area. So moving on to process 1, the identify stakeholders process group. Now what you see on the screen here, these are called as the ITTOs. I stands for input, TT stands for tools and techniques, and O stands for outputs. And usually these are the most difficult ones to answer in the PMP exam. But we are having a very logical way of remembering these things, so I'm sure that you're going to ace the exam very well. So coming to the first part, which is the input. So what are all the inputs that are coming in the identify stakeholders process group? The first one is the project charter. Now, why do we have the project charter as the first input? Now, if you remember, when I started with the presentation, I did say that this knowledge area is very important because in the PMBOK, if you go back to the grid, there are only 2 process groups that are coming under the initiating phase. So the project charter is the only one that is the output that is coming from the first process group that is coming under the initiating phase. So that is why the project charter is actually included as an input in the identify stakeholders process group. Now next, we have procurement documents. Now these are talking about the different contracts, etc., that you might have signed with the vendors, or you could have signed some contracts with different parts of the organization, etc. So these are all the procurement documents which are included as inputs. Now the next one is the enterprise environmental factors. Now the enterprise environmental factors are some of the things that are coming under the government industry standards, or you could have the organizational structure or the culture which is present in an organization, or you could have some trends that are local to your particular area. So these are some of the things that will be coming under the enterprise environmental factors. Again, if you remember, the enterprise environmental factors, or EES as they are called, are pretty much common to many of the inputs. And the last input that we have for the identified stakeholders process group would be the organizational process assets. Now, what do we mean by the organizational process assets? Now, usually, what what I tell people is these are some of the things that you can actually see. So, if you can actually see those things, that will be included as the organizational process assets. If you can touch and feel those things. So, some of the organizational process assets that we have for the identified stakeholders, that would be the stakeholder registered templates. We could have lessons learned that are coming from the previous projects. The stakeholder registered templates would also be coming from the previous projects, so there is no need for you to go and reinvent the wheel. Or sometimes you could actually have the actual stakeholder register that is coming from a similar project that has been carried out in your organization earlier. So the inputs that we have under the identified stakeholders would be the project charter. That is because that is the output of the first process group that is coming under the initiating phase. Then we have procurement documents, because at that stage you may have some contracts, SOWs, etc. We may also have some enterprise environmental factors, like there are some ethics that we need to conform to. There might be some industry standards that we may have to meet, or there may be some regulations, or there could be some product standards that we may have to meet, and it could also refer to some trends that are particular to a certain place or to an industry. Now, coming to the organizational process assets, those could be the templates or the lessons learned of actual register, that is a stakeholder register that is coming from the previous project. Now, coming to the tools and techniques, one of the important tools and techniques that we will be doing is the stakeholder analysis. Now, this is very important. The stakeholder analysis is very important because we need to identify, we need to come up with the management strategies to deal with a lot of stakeholders, some of whom may not be actually supporting our project, and we also need to find who are the negative stakeholders. If so, we need to make sure that we are addressing their concerns too. So you will see a lot of questions that are coming from these tools and techniques. This particular one, that is the stakeholder analysis. I'm going to go in detail in a moment regarding this stakeholder analysis. The next tool and technique that we have will be the expert judgment, and we also have meetings. That is a part of the tools and techniques of the identified stakeholders process group. We will revisit this slide, but first I'm going to move to the next slide so I can explain in detail what do we mean by the stakeholder analysis. Now, to identify the stakeholders, we have a few different ways of identifying them. And here on the slide, you can see some of the most common ways in which the stakeholders can be identified. So it is up to you to adopt to the particular style that you may like or you find useful in your particular organization. One of the ways of identifying the stakeholders would be based on their power and interest grid. That is, we are trying to find out how much power does this particular stakeholder have. Now, what do we mean by power? It refers to the level of authority they have within the organization. Now, what do we mean by interest? Now, interest of a stakeholder means the level of concern they have regarding the outcome of that particular project. So we can identify and group the stakeholders based on the power and the interest that they might have. Power depends upon the authority they have. Some of the people may be very high up in the organization. So regarding those people, we need to have some effective strategies so that way they are satisfied, because if the sponsor is not going to be happy with our project, then the person could pull the plug anytime. So that is why this is of utmost importance that we do a stakeholder analysis before we actually start with the project. So that way we know how to address issues when they occur. And we also need to know their concern that would refer to the interest that they have. Now, moving to the second way of analyzing the stakeholders, that would be using the power and influence grid. Now, power, we have already explained in the first method of analysis. So power means it is based on the authority that the various stakeholders have. Now, what do we mean by influence? Influence refers to their involvement in the project. Now, all people may not have the same influence throughout the life cycle of the project. So during those times, we need to have some strategies so we can deal with those changes, and we also need to be flexible enough to accommodate all these changes as they happen during the life cycle of the project. So we can also analyze the stakeholders based on the power and influence that they have. And usually in the PMP exam, these are some of the topics that will come up for the questions. So we need to pay attention here. That way we can easily relate to the questions, because in the PMP, it is not going to be a straightforward question. Like if somebody asks, does the stakeholder analysis fall under the tools and techniques of identify stakeholders process group, then we can easily give an yes or a no answer. But what happens in the PMP exam is it's mainly scenario based. So first of all, we have to identify the scenario. Like the question itself will not be straightforward. So we have to realize in the question, when we are describing a scenario, we need to figure out that we are actually in the identifying stakeholders process group. Now, if we are in the process of identifying the different stakeholders, then we are actually in the initiating phase of the project. So we are coming somewhere early on in the project, and that is why we explain it in this way. So it's easy to remember when you get when you're actually facing the 4-hour exam. Now, the third way of analyzing the stakeholders would be by using an influence and an impact grid. Now, what do we mean by influence? As we stated earlier, that would refer to the involvement they have in the project, and impact means we are talking about their ability to affect changes while we are planning the project or executing the project. So usually in the PMBOK, you can see that they're playing around with these words that is interest, influence, and impact. So we need to make sure that we have them right before we go in for the exam. Now, one of the more popular methods of analysis would be the salience model, where we are actually describing the stakeholders based on their power. So power, we know, is the level of authority they have, and some of them we may also be able to impose their will. So we need to be aware of that. We also need to know about the urgency that a stakeholder might have. Like if it's a regulatory body that is coming in and saying that we need to be compliant with something, then of course it is of utmost importance and it's an urgent matter, and we need to respond to those issues right away. So that is what we mean by urgency. And legitimacy. Now, what do we mean by legitimacy? Sometimes while we are working on projects, we might find that Some people who are unnecessary are trying to get involved in the project, and they might actually slow down the project. So that is where the salience model actually comes in useful. So this identified stakeholder actually has the stakeholder analysis as one of the tools and techniques, and the stakeholder technique, I mean the stakeholder analysis techniques, are usually very useful, whether it's for the PMP exam or whether it's a real life project. And now, to give you an example of how we actually put it on a document, okay, on a document, or you could actually be keeping it to yourself too. Now, this is how, if you look at the slide, this is an example of how we actually analyze the stakeholders. Now, this is one of the most popular models, and that is why I have this on the screen. And you will also find this in the PMBOK 5th edition as well as the 4th edition. But in the 4th edition, it will be coming under the communications area. Now, this particular graph that we have it is called a power and interest grid. So what we are doing is we are plotting power versus the interest that the stakeholder has. Now, what do we mean by interest? If you go back to the previous slide, we have said interest means the level of concern that the stakeholders have in the success or failure of our project. Now, if you see this graph, we can find out that there are 4 quadrants. Now, what do we mean by quadrants? Quadrants means these boxes that we have. Now, here's the next part. How do we interpret this graph? Like I said, I have found this stakeholder analysis, this method, useful in real life projects too. And once I explain this thing to you, I'm sure you're going to find it useful in your real life project as well as answering the PMP exam question. Now, in the power interest grid, if you go on this axis, that is the power axis, at the bottom, you have the people who are, low in power, and the power increases in this direction. So the people who are coming way here have lower power, and the people who are coming high up here have higher power. So that is why this arrow, this axis is pointing upwards, because as you go higher up, their power also increases. Now, coming to the x-axis, that will be the interest. Now, in the interest means that we are talking about the level of concern. So the people who are coming here near the origin, they will have a low interest, and as we move on in this direction, then their interest increases in the outcome of our project. Now, we have labeled these 4 quadrants. Now, we have to give the rationale behind the labeling of this quadrant. Now, let's start with the people who are having things which are lower. Now, the people who are having a low power in the organization, that means they don't have too much authority, and they also have a low interest in the project. Now, these are the people whom you need to monitor. So these people you may not spend too much time on because they have lower power as well as lower interest in the project. So it's just enough if you monitor them. Now, if we move to the people, who are higher up, these are people who are having an authority, who are having some authority in the organization, but their interest is low. So for those people who are having high power, but their interest is low, such kind of stakeholders, you just need to keep them satisfied, because if you don't keep them satisfied, it would backfire on you, because they tend to have higher power. So that is the reason we say that even though their interest is low, we still need to keep them satisfied, because ultimately they do have some power. Now, coming to this quadrant, we have labeled it as the keep informed quadrant. Now, that is because the people in this quadrant, they may have low power, but they do have a high interest in the project. So they would be coming back to you, asking you various questions about the project. So that is why you need to keep these people informed. So that is why I have these alphabets here. This B and G, etc. They stand for people. Say for example, somebody with D, David, he's having a low power, but he has a high interest in the project. So that means we need to place him in the keep informed quadrant. So these alphabets here refer to some hypothetical people who may be involved in the project. The same with G. Let's say G is for Gary, or so this Gary may have low power, but he may have a high interest. So we need to include them in all our communications plans. So when we send out the status updates, etc., we need to make sure that we do send the appropriate status updates to these people. If not, they are going to keep on asking questions, and if they copy a bunch of people, it is going to reflect poorly on us. Now, the people who are high up in this quadrant are the ones that we really need to pay attention to. Now, these people who, like, say, B or E, okay, like for B, maybe we can use the example of Bob. Bob may have very high power, and his interest is also very high. So this person has to be continuously engaged in the project. So there is no way we can upset this person, B or E, because they are the ones who are actually going to help us take the project to completion. So that is why we have to pay a lot of attention to this quadrant, which is managed closely. Now, this particular grid is something that I have found very useful in real-life projects, as well as answering the questions in the PMP exam. So I hope you take away this particular quadrant. Now, moving back to the ITTOs that we had in the Identify Stakeholders Process Group, we saw the stakeholder analysis. We saw that there are different ways of doing the stakeholder analysis, and we also saw one particular way of doing it, which is based on the power and interest that the various stakeholders have. Now, the other important tool and technique would be the expert judgment. Expert judgment it means we are talking to people who have some experience in doing similar kind of projects. Or they could be SMEs or subject matter experts. It could be your sponsor, or it could be other team members who have been involved in similar kind of projects earlier on, or it could be some other project manager who has expertise in doing some similar kind of projects. So that person could easily tell you what are the lessons learned that are coming from previous projects. And we also can have some meetings to identify the stakeholders, which is something that we will do during the project, because we need to speak to people in order to find out what is their level and what is their interest in the project. Now, the output of the Identify Stakeholders Process Group would be the stakeholder register. And this is a very important output that is coming during the course of the project. So do you have any questions? Because we have finished with the first process. Do you have any questions? Okay, I'm assuming that I'm being very clear. So let's move on to the second process. The second process is the plan stakeholder engagement. Now, as we said in the first process group, it was coming under the initiating phase. And after we have identified the stakeholders in the initiating phase, we are moving to making some plans to continuously engage the stakeholders. Now, again, this is the ITTO, which is coming for the plan stakeholder engagement. Now, what are the various inputs that we can have here? We can have the project management plan, because we are in the planning phase. There will be some project management plan, at least a draft version of it would be there. And we also have the stakeholder register, which is coming from the previous process group, which was the identified stakeholders. So the output from the previous process group is becoming an input to the next process group, which is the planned stakeholder engagement group, which is falling under the stakeholder engagement knowledge area. And we also have the enterprise environmental factors as well as the organizational process assets. So these enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets we have discussed in the previous function, and this is also pretty similar. Now, coming to the tools and techniques that we might have in the planned stakeholder engagement process group. Now, the first one will be the expert judgment. Now, what do we mean by expert judgment? This means we are talking to people who have expertise in this particular kind of projects. It could be senior management, or it could be other units within our organization, or it could also refer to some key stakeholders who are a part of our project. So that is what we mean by expert judgment. That is, we are talking to people. We are in the process of talking to people and gathering information on how to effectively carry out the project. And the next one is meeting. Of course, in order to obtain the expert judgment, we need to have the meetings with these different stakeholders, and we also need to analyze information about their roles, their interests, their knowledge, etc. And now, coming to the analytical techniques that we might have, the analytical techniques is a very important tool and technique, and you will definitely get some questions in the PMP, and of course it's very important from a real life project management area too. So let's see, what is this analytical technique? Now basically we are classifying stakeholders into 5 different groups. The first kind of stakeholder is a person who might be unaware. So these kind of stakeholders, they are unaware of the project or the impact the project may have on whatever work they are doing. Okay. The second kind of stakeholder would be the person who is resistant to the changes that are going to come with your project. So this person is actually aware of the project and the impacts that they might have on their roles. So that is why they are resisting the change that is going to come. So this kind of person, the person who is resistant to change, is a person whom we need to really manage well. Now the third person, the third category would be the neutral stakeholder. Now the neutral stakeholder is actually aware of the project, but the person is neither supportive nor resistant. They do not support you in your actions, nor do they resist whatever you do. So they are just neutral or sitting on the fence. The fourth the category would be the ones who are supportive of the project. Now the person who is supportive should be aware of the project and the impact, and they are trying to protect, they are trying to support you so the project goes to completion. And if at all during the course of the project, in real life, if you ever have any difficulty, then this is the category of stakeholders that we need to approach, because they are the ones who are really going to help us take the project to completion. Now the last category would be the leading category. Now these kind of stakeholders, they are aware of the project as well as the impact, and they are actually leading the show. They are actively pursuing the project. They are making sure they are continuously engaged, and they want to make sure that the project is a success at any rate. So these are some of the analytical techniques that we employ for the tools and techniques that are coming under the plan stakeholder engagement process group. As I said, this analytical techniques is very important, whether it's a real life project or whether it's a PMP exam. Now the outputs that are coming from this process group would be coming up with the stakeholder management plan, So we need to come up with a plan. It is coming under the planning phase. So we need to come up with a plan to deal with the various type of stakeholders that we have identified in the earlier process group, which was the identified stakeholders group. Now, since we made a plan, we need to make some updates to the project document. That is why we have project document updates as an output of this particular process area. Now, again, this is a code which I found very useful in real life too. Now, remember we were saying that there are these 5 different categories of stakeholders. Now, we can actually put these 5 different categories in a sort of a grid like this, and this is very useful in, real life. But the only thing that you have to be careful is make sure that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. So usually, even though we have mentioned here as stakeholder 1, 2, and 3, etc., what we normally do is we just put initials or something like that, so that way you can identify who the person is. But if you happen to lose the template, or if it falls into the wrong hands, they will not be able to find out what those, what is the person that you're referring to. Now here we are having on the header of this table, we are having the 5 different categories that we talked about in the previous slide, that is unaware, resistant, neutral, supportive, and leading. Now you can see that there are 2 alphabets that we have used here. Now C stands for current. Now what I'm trying to explain in the slide is I'm having stakeholder 1, the first stakeholder, say for example, Bob or Gary or somebody. Right now, that person, the current state is actually neutral. So we need to have a strategy to bring this person from the neutral category into the supportive category. Now moving to stakeholder 2, you want the person to actually support your project. So that is your desired outcome. D stands for desire. And stakeholder number 2 is actually supporting your project. So there is nothing that you need to do to, actually engage this person. You just need to keep on doing what you're currently doing, because what you're doing currently now is working. Now moving on to stakeholder number 3, right now the person, current state, C stands for current state, the person is unaware of the project. So first of all, we need to make the person aware of the project. So we need to have a management strategy which will move the person from C, that is current state of unaware, into the desired state, which is the supportive state. So our stakeholder management strategy should include something to move stakeholder 3 from the unaware category into the supportive category. So that is with the second process group. So do you have any questions before we move on to the next one? So I'm assuming so far everybody has been able to follow what we have been trying to accomplish in this webinar. So let's move on to the third process, and we're also going to run out of time. So let me quickly go through the third process. Now the third process is manage stakeholder engagement. As we said in the earlier slide, managing the person comes under the executing phase. So that means already the project is going in full steam. So for this process group, what are all the inputs that we have? We have the stakeholder management plan, which actually came from the earlier process group. Then we have the communications management plan, because we are in the executing phase of the project. So we need to have a plan that will communicate all the status updates to these different stakeholders. Now, during the course of the project, people might realize that some changes need to be made, and that is what is called as a change log. Sorry about that. Change log tells about the changes that the different stakeholders want to see in your project. And of course, the one of the other inputs that we have for this process group would be the organizational process assets. Now, moving to the tools and techniques in this process group, we need to have communication methods. Now, these communication methods are dependent upon the quadrants that we were talking earlier. Remember, we were talking about manage closely. So those people with the high power as well as high interest, for these kind of stakeholders, you just need to keep on sending regular status updates. Whereas for the people who came in the keep informed quadrant, we just need to send them status updates once in a while, maybe once a month. Whereas for the people who are coming in the manage closely quadrant, maybe you need to send status updates every week. So that is how we manage the communication method. Then coming to interpersonal skills, of course, it all depends a lot upon the project manager, because we spend 90% of our time communicating with others. So we need to have many soft skills that will help us to complete the project. Now, the last tool and technique under this process group would be the management skills. Now, of course, we were talking about the management strategy, which was coming from the earlier process group, which was the planned stakeholder engagement. Now, we need to have effective methods. So if a negative stakeholder is actually trying to come up in the project, then we need to make sure that we neutralize the theme there. Now, coming to the output of this particular process group, the first output that we have is the issue log. Again, this is something that you will see in real life. You will have an issue log, and the project manager will actually be actively managing the issue log. He'll make sure that we address issues as and when they happen. The next output that we have is the change request. Now, the change requests are the outputs that are coming from the change log. People have asked us for some changes. We carried out those changes, and the outputs are the change requests. We actually talk to the key stakeholders and find out what are the changes that we need to make, and the official one that comes out is called as a change request, or CR in real life. And of course, when we make all these changes, we need to make updates to the project management plan, as well as the project documents and the organizational process updates. Now, some of the activities that we have during this process group would be engaging the stakeholders at appropriate project stages. So we make sure that we are managing their expectations. We are also addressing the concerns that they might have, and we are clarifying and resolving the issues that have been identified. Now, coming to the last process group, which is the controlled stakeholder engagement. Now, this comes under the monitoring and controlling process group. The word control is an indicator here. Now, some of the inputs that we have for this group will be the project management plan, the issue log that came in from the previous process group, that was the managed stakeholder engagement. Then we have work performance data. Now, what do we mean by work performance data? We are talking about how much completion has been achieved in the project, etc. That is all called as work performance data. That means raw data. And we could have some project documents, some SOWs or something, that would actually help us here. Now, coming to the tools and techniques, we make use of information management system. We are making changes to the project plan. We are sending communication, email, etc. through the information management system. Then the project is in full progress, so we need to hold meetings, and we need to talk to the experts to make sure that we are going in the right direction. Now, coming to the outputs, we have work performance information. So usually people get confused between work performance data and work performance information. Now, the difference is this: work performance data is raw data, that is just 10% complete and all that. Now, work performance information means you're actually putting it in a context. Like, you have to tell the person where you're supposed to go and where are you currently in, and how does it relate to the overall big picture. That is the meaning of work performance information. And then we have change requests that came in from the change log, and we have updates to the project management plan, the documents, as well as the organizational process assets. Now, to recap all the processes, we know that we are having 4 processes under this knowledge area. That would be the identified stakeholders, which came under initiating, and the plan stakeholder management, which was coming under the planning process book. The third one was managing the stakeholders, which came under the executing process book because the project is being executed. And the fourth and final process book in this knowledge area was the control stakeholder engagement, which came under the PMP process book or the monitoring and controlling process book. So do you have any questions? So I'll come to the end of what I have. If there are any questions, I will take those questions. If not, I will hand it over to you, Raj.
Yeah, sure. Well, Indu, I can see there's a question from Yomiyaji. I noticed that you had an issue log, but I did not see the risk of RIAD log. Is the RAID log required? Can you please, Yojima, do you want to talk and ask your query? Shall I unmute you? All right, I've unmuted you. You can speak.
Hello?
Yes, hi, please go ahead.
Hi, just a quick question. Just want to find out, because in your penultimate chart, I noticed you have a issue log there.
Yes.
That's it. No, before this one, where you have the issue log on the left-hand side.
Yes, this one.
Not this one. Issue log here is an output here, but yeah, this one.
On the input.
Yeah. On the input, you had an issue log. I'm now asking because I didn't see anything relating to risk or a rate chart. Does that require any rate chart, or it doesn't require, please?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your question. Now, issue log, it is something that we actually have during the course of the project. Now, you also have the risk log. Now, in most cases, in most organizations, what they will have is at the start of the project, they will identify the the risks that are associated with the project, right? So that is what is officially called as a RAID log. So they are identifying all the risks that might come during the due course of the project. Now, as it's executed, day by day, some of those risks might not be there anymore, right? Some of those risks might have been addressed, and what happens is in your day-to-day activities, the problems that you come across are actually put into a log, which is called as an issue log. Now, this issue log is something, in most organizations, it will actually be a sort of Excel spreadsheet. That is what they will use. So here, what they will tell is, in the issue log, they will just say, what is the problem that the person is having, okay? Say, for example, if it is a web development project, one of the stakeholders, what they have said is, always people have been complaining, maybe during the due course of the project, they just realized that the IT team is working on some changes, so why not, ask them for more changes? So they're telling that there is too much content on the website. Instead, I want to make, I want to represent the information graphically. I want to put some charts there or something like that. Some changes. So those kind of things are what come up in an issue log. So we will just say just have a brief description on what is the change that the people want to see, and who are the people. In the next column, we will say who are the, what is the team that is actually working on it, and in the third column, we will say who are the actual resources for working on that particular issue, okay? And we will also say in brief how we are addressing the issue. So that is what is called as an issue log. Now, an issue log is something that you will use in an everyday project, whereas a RAID log is something that you would have started it during the initial phases of the project itself. Some of those risks may have been identified, and they might go away during the due course of the project, but you will have some nitty-gritty things that are going on every day. Those are the kind of things that will come in an issue log. So did I address your question?
All right. There's one more question. What is the percentage of questions we expect from this knowledge area in the PMP exam?
Usually you can expect about 5 to 7 questions in this knowledge area. And all these questions will be, it is always, scenario based. That means they won't actually ask you a question. It will not be a straightforward question. Instead, you will have to identify the phase we are in and then come up with an answer. Now, let me ask a question, because this is something that usually comes up in the PMP exam. And this is also something for real life. Now, the question that will usually come up is, when do you do the identify stakeholders? When do you actually identify the stakeholders during the course of a project? Now, we said that during this knowledge area, we said that, see, in the very beginning, we said that this is coming, the identifying stakeholders is actually coming as process number 1, which is coming in the initiating phase. But in real life, what happens is, what happens is during the course of the project, things do change. So this identify stakeholders is actually an iterative process. So that means it happens throughout the life cycle of the project, because some people, they could have been hired newly. Some new stakeholder could come into your project. That person might be a new hire, or the old person who was there, they would have just moved his team or moved his or her team. So that person who was actively contributing to the project may no longer be there. So we have to include the new person who has come in. So this identify stakeholders is an iterative process. And that is a question that you will regularly see in the PMP exam. And usually you can expect about 5 to 7 questions that are coming up in this particular knowledge group. So you will get this question from the iterative process. That is one thing that you will usually get. And let me quickly tell you, where are the other areas where you will get questions. Now see this particular slide where you're having the different stakeholder analysis methods, right? You have to pay real attention to these 4 analysis methods. This is something that will come up in the exam, but of course, it's not going to be straightforward like what is mentioned here, but instead they will put it in a story format and they will ask you the same question. So you just have to identify, just take the story away and find the root thing, what they are trying to ask in the question. And the next one that you have to pay real attention to is this particular quadrant that you are seeing right now, because you will get a lot of questions. Like the question will not be straightforward. They will not ask, which person is falling under managed closely quadrant or something like that. It will not say a person is having high interest as well as high power. So in which quadrant should you place this person? And if the question was so simple, you can easily give the answer as managed closely. But the PMP exam will not be so straightforward. Instead, they will say, like say I've given here B, right? I'm just saying that a person with initial of B. Now instead they will say, now Bob is a person who is the executive director, and he is actively involved in the project. He wants to make sure that the project goes to completion. What kind of communication will you need to send to keep this person happy, or what kind of communication or what kind of engagement do you need to have for Bob? Now then it becomes difficult, right? So we have to go back to the question and we have to realize that the person was an executive director. So that means the person is high up in the organization, right? Definitely the person is not low. That much we can make out. Whether he is middle or high, he is coming somewhere in this area. And they're saying that he really wants the project to be successful. So we need to manage this person closely because he also has a high interest in the project. Now this is one slide where you will definitely get questions. Then you will definitely get questions in this particular slide. You will get questions based on analytical techniques. So please make sure that you go through these techniques, and you will usually get questions based on this. These 5 methods of clarifying the stakeholders: unaware, resistance, neutral, supportive, leading. So you should exactly know what is the difference. Then You should know how to come up with this matrix. Again, this is something that will be useful for real life too. You have to remember that C stands for current and D stands for desired. That is where we want to take them. Okay. Then coming to the third process, which will be managing. So there you could get questions again based on the communication methods that we have, the interpersonal skills that we have. Then regarding change requests, you might get some questions, because usually change request is not something that the project manager can authorize someone to do. It needs some authorization from somebody higher up in the organization. So you could see questions from that, because it's coming from authority, and that is what I have tried to explain here, because here it's a continuous communication process. And then coming to the process number 4, you could get questions on this information management systems, like, how do you do this, how do you do that, and all that. Like, how frequently should you send a communication to this person? Is it every day? Is it daily? Is it daily, or is it every week or monthly, etc. So that is pretty much the questions that will be coming from this knowledge area.
Indu, there is one more question by Nivashini. She's saying, why is a change log as input? Change log is output of integrated change control when a change requirement is approved or rejected.
Yeah, because the project is in progress, right? So there could be changes that are coming in during the due course of the project. So that is why we include it as an input to this particular process flow.